Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Jamestown, Powhatan diplomacy, and the tobacco colony. The core question is this: how long can a speculative colony survive when it lands hungry inside a native political world it does not control? The core competency is to relate incidents of both cooperation and conflict between European colonizers and native peoples. How long can a speculative colony survive when it lands hungry inside a native political world it does not control? Jamestown began in 1607 as a commercial venture backed by the Virginia Company, a joint stock company that expected return on investment. The settlers who arrived did not land in empty space. They entered Seneca, the region controlled by Wahan Seneca, known to the English as Powhatan, and by the allied peoples of the Powhatan Confederacy. The colony therefore opened inside an existing native political world that already possessed villages, tribute relationships, agricultural cycles, and military force. The English selected a defensible site on a marshy peninsula along the James River and quickly built a triangular fort. Defensive logic guided the choice, but the location also produced problems. Brackish water, insects, disease, and limited food made life unstable from the first months. Many settlers were gentlemen or men with expectations of quick gain rather than seasoned agricultural workers. Company planners hoped for trade, precious metals, or a passage to Asia. Instead, they found that fort construction, food gathering, and diplomacy controlled survival more than speculation. The Virginia Company operated through distant investors who wanted profit without enduring local conditions. Company leaders issued instructions, appointed council members, and demanded results, yet they could not control weather, hunger, or native politics from London. That gap between investor expectation and colonial reality shaped the settlement from the beginning. Jamestown was less a ready-made colony than a business experiment under severe physical strain. Powhatan faced a different problem. A new foreign settlement had appeared within his region. He could attempt immediate destruction, conditional trade, containment, or incorporation into tribute relations. His confederacy already coordinated more than 24 Algonquian-speaking communities. Power depended on food redistribution, strategic marriages, tribute collection, and the capacity to command allies. The English were weak, but they were also unpredictable. Powhatan had to judge whether they could be used, tolerated, or eliminated. From the first season then, Jamestown was a place where two political systems tested each other. The English brought corporate finance, fortification, and imperial claims. Powhatan's world brought territorial knowledge, food production, and regional authority. Survival depended on how those systems interacted. The fort itself exposed English priorities. Settlers spent precious time raising walls, storing powder, and maintaining a defensive perimeter because they expected danger and wanted a foothold they could hold long enough to profit from. Defense absorbed labor that might otherwise have gone into planting. The result was a colony that looked prepared for enemies while remaining badly unprepared for hunger. The Powhatan Confederacy organized life in Tidewater, Virginia before the English arrived. Villages farmed corn, beans, and squash, fished local waters, hunted game, and paid tribute upward through a hierarchy of local and regional authority. Powhatan consolidated influence through marriage alliances, military action, and redistribution of food and goods. European observers often reduced this system to personal rule, but it functioned as a structured political order adapted to Chesapeake conditions. The English failed to understand that order at first. They often treated individual encounters as isolated negotiations, rather than as dealings within a larger native power structure. They also misjudged the demands of the environment. Some settlers spent time searching for gold or exploring rather than planting enough food. Others assumed resupply would solve shortfalls. The colony's internal leadership disputes further weakened discipline, disease spread through the fort, and hunger remained constant. Trade with native communities became necessary. Corn deliveries and exchange helped keep the colony alive in its weakest periods. English dependence on native food revealed the limits of company planning. A fort and a charter could not produce grain by themselves. The colony needed time, labor, and local knowledge that it did not yet possess. Powhatan understood that dependence and could use it. John Smith emerged as one of the most forceful English leaders during these early years. He pushed for tighter discipline and for practical work rather than idle expectation. His authority remained contested, but he understood better than some other settlers that the colony would collapse without organized labor and controlled relations with native communities. Even so, his writings later magnified his own role and require careful reading. The world before open breakdown therefore contained unstable cooperation. Native exchange and English persistence kept the settlement alive, yet neither side entered the relationship on equal terms. The English intended to remain and profit. Powhatan intended to preserve authority in his own territory. The tension could be managed temporarily, but the underlying goals already pointed toward conflict. Seasonal rhythms sharpened the imbalance. Native farmers already understood local planting and harvest cycles. The English arrived needing food at once and often out of sequence with those cycles. Dependence on trade therefore reflected timing as well as weakness. A colony that missed planting season had no easy way to recover before winter. The winter of 1609 to 1610, remembered as the starving time, exposed the colony's failures with brutal clarity. Fresh settlers had arrived, but supplies were inadequate and leadership was disorganized. Powhatan's people restricted trade as relations deteriorated. The English remained confined near the fort, consumed horses, dogs, rats, and leather, and endured severe mortality. Reports from the period describe cannibalism. Of several hundred colonists present before the winter, only a small fraction survived into the spring. This crisis exposed the failure because it revealed the collapse of the original business model. The Virginia Company had imagined returns from trade and extraction, yet the colony could not consistently feed its own population. A settlement that could not sustain laborers could not produce wealth. The starving time, therefore, was not a simple famine. It was a demonstration that corporate ambition, poor planning, and military insecurity had failed together in public view. Powhatan's strategy during this period makes practical sense in that context. Continued unrestricted trade would strengthen an intrusive settlement. Restriction and pressure might force retreat or subordination. Native leaders did not face a harmless refugee camp. They faced foreigners who had built a fort, demanded resources, and still claimed legitimacy under a distant crown. Tightening access to food was a political act. John Smith's famous rule, "He that will not work shall not eat," belonged to this larger struggle over survival and discipline. The phrase reveals a colony where labor had to be enforced because resources were scarce and social expectations were unstable. Smith wanted settlers to cut wood, repair defenses, gather food, and follow orders. The line has lasted because it condenses the settlement's immediate reality. The colony could not survive on status or hope. It required coordinated work. The English barely escaped total collapse in 1610 when additional ships and officials arrived. Lord Delaware imposed harsher military order. Company leaders began reconsidering how the colony should function. Survival now required more than occasional rescue. It required a repeatable system that could align labor, export value, and continued migration. That administrative reset also changed the colony's chain of command. Martial discipline, scheduled labor, and stricter punishment made the settlement look less like an improvised camp and more like a controlled outpost. The shift did not create prosperity by itself. It showed that company managers had abandoned the fantasy that Virginia would reward disorder. John Smith's General History of Virginia, published in 1624, mixes observation, self-defense, and political argument. Smith wanted readers to see him as practical, disciplined, and central to Jamestown's survival. He wrote after many of the events and shaped the story to elevate his own authority. That motive requires caution. Yet the text still gives historians valuable evidence because its self-presentation exposes what the colony lacked. Smith's line, "He that will not work shall not eat," is one example. It sounds like a command from a firm leader, and it is. It also admits scarcity, idleness, and administrative weakness. A colony with abundant food and stable labor does not need to make that rule famous. The sentence records a settlement where work discipline had become essential because the margin for failure was so small. Smith's pages also reveal English dependence on native power. Smith describes trade, negotiation, and encounters with Powhatan's people because those interactions structured colonial survival. His later rescue story about Pocahontas became one of the best-known episodes in early American memory, but even when readers bracket the legend, the document still shows a colony entangled with native authority rather than operating independently. The tension inside the source comes from that combination. Smith tries to write an English survival epic, but the text repeatedly points back to dependence on native food, native diplomacy, and local political realities. The colony appears active and determined, yet never fully autonomous. The account therefore supports two facts at once. English leaders tried to claim command. Native conditions still shape the terms of life. This tension is decisive because later public memory often converted Jamestown into a story of founding resolve. Smith's own narrative helped that conversion. A closer reading brings the colony back down to its actual operating level. A vulnerable fort, a failing company scheme, and a population alive only through discipline, resupply, and native interaction. Smith's account also records barter, reconnaissance, and recurring anxiety over supply. Those details expose capacity because they locate colonial power at a low level of capacity. The English could write grand claims for London readers, yet on the ground they still worried about corn, tools, and whether local diplomacy would hold another week. Jamestown became durable after survival linked to a marketable crop and a stronger settlement engine. John Rolfe successfully cultivated a strain of tobacco that English consumers wanted. Tobacco exports gave Virginia a commodity that could anchor the colony's finances. Once merchants could ship leaf to England and recover profit, investors and settlers had a clearer reason to remain. Tobacco also changed the colony's land and labor demands. The crop exhausted soil and required acreage near waterways for transport. More fields meant more clearing, more fences, more storage buildings, and more workers. The headright system intensified this process by granting land to those who paid passage for themselves or others. Land grants converted migration into territorial expansion. Each new arrival could translate into another claim pushed deeper into native space. Company and then colonial authorities also repaired administration. Representative institutions such as the House of Burgesses emerged in 1619, county organization expanded across the 17th century, and local courts began structuring everyday governance. These developments made Virginia more than a fort awaiting rescue. They created a settler routine of planting, surveying, shipping, litigating, and governing that could reproduce itself from year to year. Pocahontas's captivity, conversion, and marriage to John Rolfe in 1614 helped produce a temporary peace, but the peace rested on unstable foundations. It allowed English population and tobacco production to grow. It did not resolve the deeper conflict over land and sovereignty. Once profit and migration accelerated, the English had stronger incentives to seize more ground and weaker incentives to remain contained. The consequences therefore double. Native diplomacy made early survival possible, and English commercial adaptation made later expansion durable. Jamestown did not become significant because it succeeded immediately. It became significant because a near failure found a crop, a labor regime, and a land system capable of expansion. That combination turned a weak foothold into a lasting colonial problem for native peoples across the Chesapeake. By the 1620s, wharves, storehouses, scattered plantations, and county offices made that expansion visible in the landscape. Ships loaded tobacco on the river, surveyors marked claims, local courts heard disputes over debt, labor, and boundaries. What had once been a threatened outpost now reproduced itself through ordinary colonial routine. The unresolved judgment follows directly from that history. If Jamestown survived first through native exchange and later through tobacco and land grants, which force did the greater work in shaping Virginia, diplomacy or profit? The colony needed both in sequence, and the second one made future conflict harder to stop. Virginia survived through diplomacy, tobacco, and land seizure in a sequence that leaves no clean founding story. The harder judgment is whether a colony preserved by native exchange and then stabilized by expansion could ever grow without making future dispossession more likely. That question remains inside the very success the colony later claimed.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.